The country you call France did not exist before him. There was no France in 700 AD. There was no French language, no French border, no French identity. There were Romans who had stopped being Romans. There were Gauls who had forgotten they were Gauls. There were Germanic warriors called Franks who had been slowly taking over for 2 centuries. And then one man changed everything. He unified what would become France. He drew the border that would become Germany. He wrote laws that shaped English common law. He saved classical literature from being lost forever. He imposed Christianity across a continent with a combination of scholarship and systematic violence. He had nearly 20 children. He walked with a limp in his final years. His bones are in Aachen, Germany. His hair, recovered from a wax seal on a document in Paris, was dark brown shot through with blonde before it turned white. And his DNA is almost certainly running through your veins right now. He was not French. He was not German. He came before both. His name was Charlemagne. This is the French DNA mystery, and this is where Europe begins. To understand Charlemagne's DNA story, we first need to understand what French DNA actually is. Because France is not one people. France is a genetic crossroads, a layered archive of every great migration and invasion that swept through Western Europe over 15,000 years. The deepest layer belongs to the hunter-gatherers who were here when the ice retreated, around 13,000 years ago. These were the people who painted the cave walls at Lascaux. Their genetic signature, the haplogroup known as I, still pulses faintly in the French genome today. Then came the first farmers from Anatolia, modern Turkey, around 7,000 years ago. They brought agriculture, pottery, and a genetic profile dominated by haplogroup G2A. They spread across Western Europe and transformed it. They absorbed, or in some cases replaced, much of what came before them. Around 3000 BCE, the steppe nomads arrived. The Yamnaya, vast, mobile, horse-riding people from the grasslands north of the Black Sea. They carried haplogroup R1b, and it spread like wildfire. In France today, R1b reaches 60% of the male population. When you trace a French man's paternal line back far enough, there is a better than even chance it leads to those Bronze Age horsemen from the Russian steppe. Then the Celts, the Romans who occupied Gaul for 5 centuries and left their Latin in the bones of the French language. The Visigoths, the Burgundians, a dozen waves of people, each leaving their mark. And finally, the people who gave France its name, the Franks. The Franks were a Germanic people from the region around the Rhine Delta, modern Belgium and Western Germany. They spoke a Germanic language. They fought with axes. They were pagans who converted to Christianity under their king Clovis around 496 AD. And from the 5th century onward, they became the dominant political power in what had been Roman Gaul. Ancient DNA studies of Merovingian-era burial sites in northern France show a distinct Germanic genetic component entering the population from this period. Frankish elites show elevated frequencies of haplogroups R1b and I1 compared to the local Gallo-Roman population they ruled. This was not just a cultural overlay, it was a real genetic contribution. Frankish blood entering the French genome. And the most genetically influential Frankish blood in all of Western European history came from one family, the Carolingians. Charlemagne did not emerge from nowhere. He was the product of one of the most extraordinary dynasties in medieval history. And to understand him, you need to understand his grandfather. Charles Martel, the Hammer. In October of 732 AD, an army of the Umayyad Caliphate crossed the Pyrenees into what is now France. They had already conquered Spain. They had swept across North Africa and the Middle East. They were now advancing northward through the heart of Western Europe, heading toward Tours. Charles Martel met them with his Frankish infantry. What happened near Tours stopped the Umayyad advance cold. For the first time in a century of almost unbroken expansion, the Caliphate retreated. Historians still debate how decisive this battle was in the long arc of history, but its consequences for our story are clear. Charles Martel emerged as the undisputed strongman of Western Europe. The power he won became the inheritance of his sons, and it was his grandson who would transform that inheritance into an empire. Charles Martel's son, Charlemagne's father, was Pepin. History calls him Pepin the Short, a nickname that tells you everything about how chroniclers loved to find irony in powerful men. Pepin was short in stature. He was not short in ambition. At this time, the Frankish kingdom had a king, a Merovingian king, who held the title but none of the actual power. Pepin held the power. He was what the Franks called mayor of the palace, effectively the prime minister, the general, the real ruler. The king sat on his throne and did nothing. Pepin wanted to fix this. He sent word to Pope Zachary in Rome, posing a careful theological question. Is it right that the man who holds all the real power does not hold the title? The Pope's answer was no, it was not right. The title should follow the power. In 751, Pepin deposed the last Merovingian king, sent him to a monastery, and was elected King of the Franks by the Frankish nobility. He was anointed by Archbishop Boniface of Mainz. The Carolingian dynasty, named for Charles, for Charlemagne, had begun. 3 years later, Pope Stephen II made the long journey over the Alps from Rome, the first pope ever to cross into northern Europe. He anointed Pepin again in a grand ceremony at the Basilica of Saint-Denis. He gave Pepin and his sons the title of Patrician of the Romans. He bound the papacy and the Frankish throne together in an alliance that would shape European history for 1,000 years. One of the sons anointed at Saint-Denis was a boy of about 12 years old. His name was Charles. He would become Charles the Great. He would become Charlemagne. Charlemagne was born in approximately 742 AD. The exact date is unknown, even to him. Contemporary records disagree. Some say the 2nd of April. Some say the year was 747. Even the place of his birth is debated. Modern Belgium, modern Germany, somewhere in the Frankish heartland. This ambiguity is itself a kind of truth. In the 8th century, there were no birth certificates. There was no fixed national identity. The Frankish world was fluid, tribal, defined by loyalty rather than geography. Charlemagne was born into that fluidity, and he spent his life trying to impose order on it. His mother was Bertrada of Lens, called Bertha Bigfoot by later chroniclers, possibly as a term of affection rather than mockery. She was a woman of remarkable political intelligence. She negotiated her son's first marriage. She travelled to Rome to smooth his relationship with the papacy. She was one of the very few people Charlemagne consistently listened to. His father Pepin died in 768. The Frankish kingdom passed to Charlemagne and his brother Carloman jointly. They co-ruled uneasily. Tensions built, and then, in 771, Carloman died, suddenly, of natural causes, in his early 20s. Charlemagne became sole ruler of the Franks. He was approximately 29 years old. He would not stop for the next 43 years. To understand how Charlemagne's DNA spread so completely across Europe, you have to understand his personal life, and his personal life was extraordinarily complicated. He had 4 official wives, at least 4 concubines whose names history recorded, and somewhere between 18 and 20 children, depending on which source you trust. His first partner was Himiltrude, possibly a former wife in the Frankish tradition, possibly a concubine. Historical sources disagree. She gave him a son, Pepin, who would later be known as Pepin the Hunchback. This boy, the eldest son, carried a physical disability that medieval society considered a mark against him. He would cause Charlemagne profound grief. His mother Bertrada arranged a political marriage with Desiderata, daughter of Desiderius, king of the Lombards. This was diplomacy disguised as romance. The marriage lasted less than a year. Charlemagne sent her back. No children, no explanation recorded. Just a Lombard king left humiliated, and a diplomatic wound that would fester. Then came Hildegard of Windsgau, and everything changed. She was approximately 13 or 14 years old when they married. Charlemagne was around 30. By our modern understanding, this is deeply troubling. By the standards of 8th century Frankish aristocracy, it was entirely conventional. Age at marriage for noble women was determined by dynastic need, not by anything resembling consent as we understand it. What followed was extraordinary. In 12 years of marriage, Hildegard gave Charlemagne 9 children. She was at his side on campaigns. She was, by every account that survives, the woman he loved above all others. She died in 1783. She was approximately 25 years old. Charlemagne was at war when it happened. He remarried quickly. A Frankish king could not appear vulnerable, but those who knew him said the loss never fully left him. The children Hildegard gave him include Louis the Pious, who would inherit the empire, and it is primarily through Louis that Charlemagne's genetic line descends into the royal houses of Europe. His third wife, Fastrada, is painted darkly by contemporary chroniclers, accused of cruelty, of turning Charlemagne's sons against him. Whether this is fair, or simply the tendency of male historians to place blame on women who held power, we cannot know for certain. 2 major rebellions against Charlemagne occurred during her time as queen. Now, his daughters. Charlemagne had several daughters, and he refused, absolutely refused, to let any of them marry. Despite offers from kings across Europe, despite the political advantages that royal marriages would have brought, he kept them at court, always. The historian Einhard, who knew Charlemagne personally, wrote that the emperor simply could not bear to live without them. But the daughters were not celibate. They had relationships, unofficial ones. Charlemagne looked the other way. His daughter Bertha had 2 known sons with Angilbert, a poet and court official. One of those sons, Nithard, grew up to become a historian. We know his name. We know his words. He is Charlemagne's grandson. How many other lines existed that the monks didn't bother to record? How many relationships left genetic traces that weren't important enough to write down? This is how a genome spreads through a population, not always through the royal record, sometimes through the silence between the lines. And then there is Pepin the Hunchback, the firstborn, the eldest son who should have inherited everything. In 792 AD, Pepin led a rebellion against his father. He was captured. Charlemagne sent him to a monastery, where he spent the rest of his life. His male line ended there. The eldest son of Charlemagne, the one who should have carried everything forward, vanished from the genetic record. History, sometimes, is very cruel. Charlemagne fought many wars, but no war defined him like the Saxon Wars. They began in 772. They did not end until 804, 32 years. The Saxons were pagan Germanic tribes occupying what is now northern Germany. They worshipped the old gods. They had no king. They were organised by clan, by region, by loyalty to local chieftains. This made them extraordinarily difficult to destroy. You could defeat them in battle. They would retreat into their forests and begin again. The wars were brutal from the start. In 772, Charlemagne destroyed the Irminsul, a great sacred pillar the Saxons believed held up the sky. It was a deliberate act of religious desecration, an announcement of what was coming. For 10 years the pattern repeated. The Saxons would be defeated, they would accept baptism, they would rebel again. Charlemagne would return. In 782, a Saxon leader named Widukind persuaded a group of Saxons who had submitted to Charlemagne to rise again. They ambushed a Frankish army and annihilated it. 2 of the king's most senior commanders died in the battle. Charlemagne responded with something that has haunted his reputation ever since. He gathered every Saxon he could find who had participated in the rebellion. He assembled them at a place called Verden on the river Aller in northern Germany, and he ordered their execution. The Royal Frankish Annals record it in a single sentence. 4,500 of them, in one day, beheaded. The Massacre of Verden. Historian Alessandro Barbero calls it perhaps the greatest stain on Charlemagne's reputation. The Nazis built a memorial to the Saxon victims in 1935. Some scholars have questioned the number. Some have suggested the Latin word for the heading was a copyist's error. These attempts at exoneration have been largely rejected by modern scholarship. What we know is this: Widukind, the Saxon chief who inspired the rebellion, was not at Verden. He had fled to Denmark. He surrendered 3 years later in 785. He accepted baptism. Charlemagne became his godfather. The man who ordered the massacre of 4,500 Saxons stood at the baptismal font for the man who caused it. That is not irony. That is medieval politics. The wars continued until 804. By the end, the Saxons had been absorbed into the Frankish world. Their genes, the same haplogroups carried by the Anglo-Saxons who had already crossed the Channel to England, merged into the Carolingian Empire's genetic tapestry. While the Saxon wars ground on, Charlemagne was also fighting in the south. In 773, Pope Adrian I sent an urgent message. The Lombard king Desiderius, the same man whose daughter Charlemagne had unceremoniously returned, was threatening Rome. The Pope needed help. Charlemagne moved with extraordinary speed. He gathered his forces and crossed the Alps in winter, something considered nearly impossible. His army descended into northern Italy like a hammer. The Lombard kingdom collapsed within a year. Charlemagne did not install a puppet. He absorbed the kingdom. He became king of the Lombards himself, wearing a second crown alongside his Frankish one. Not everything was triumph. In 778, Charlemagne led an expedition into northern Spain, hoping to exploit divisions within the Muslim-controlled Iberian Peninsula. The campaign failed. He turned his army around and headed home. In the Pyrenees, crossing through the mountain pass at Roncevaux, his rearguard was ambushed, not by Muslims, by Basques, local mountain warriors who resented the passage of a foreign army through their territory. The rearguard was annihilated. Among the dead was a Frankish commander named Hrudland. His death was transformed over the following centuries into one of the greatest epic poems of medieval Europe, the Song of Roland. In the poem, Hrudland becomes Roland, the perfect knight, dying heroically against impossible odds. In reality, he was killed by Basques in a mountain pass. Charlemagne never spoke of Roncevaux publicly. He buried the memory, but the legend grew anyway. From 791 to 803, Charlemagne turned east. The Avars, a nomadic people who had dominated the Pannonian Plain, modern Hungary, for 2 centuries, had been raiding and threatening European kingdoms throughout that time. Charlemagne destroyed them. The Avar Ring, their great circular fortress complex, was broken open. What came out was staggering. accumulated Byzantine gold, silver, silk, treasure gathered over centuries of raiding. The Frankish annals describe 15 wagons of gold and silver. Even if this was an exaggeration, what emerged funded Charlemagne's entire building programme: the palaces, the cathedral, the schools. The Avar people themselves ceased to exist as a distinct civilization within a generation. Ancient DNA studies of the Carpathian Basin show a sharp discontinuity in the early 9th century. The Avar genetic signature diminishes dramatically, precisely in the period of Carolingian conquest. This is one of the clearest examples in ancient DNA research of military conquest having a direct and measurable genetic impact on a population. By 800 AD, Charlemagne ruled a territory stretching from northern Spain to the borders of Denmark, from the Atlantic coast to the edge of Hungary. There had been nothing like it in Western Europe since Rome. On Christmas Day, 800 AD, Charlemagne knelt to pray at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Pope Leo III approached and placed a golden crown upon his head. The congregation roared, "To Charles, the most pious Augustus, crowned by God, the great and peaceful Emperor of the Romans, life and victory." The Western Roman Empire had been dead for over 300 years. In the eyes of the Church and the Frankish world, it had just been reborn. Charlemagne was reportedly displeased by the manner of the coronation. He later said he would never have entered the church that day had he known what the Pope intended. Some historians believe this was performance. Others believe he genuinely resented the implication that a pope had the power to grant him his title. Either way, the crown was on his head, and it would never come off. Charlemagne was not only a warrior. He was an institution builder on a scale Western Europe had not seen since the height of the Roman Empire. He established the palace school at Aachen and filled it with the greatest scholars he could find from across the known world. An English monk named Alcuin of York became his chief academic advisor. Scholars arrived from Ireland, Italy, Spain. Knowledge was treated as a form of power. Latin manuscripts, the texts of ancient Rome, the works of Virgil, Cicero, Pliny, were copied and distributed by Carolingian scribes. Without this effort, carried out under Charlemagne's direction, the majority of classical Latin literature would have been lost forever. He did not know he was saving civilization, but he did. He reformed the currency across his entire territory. He standardized weights and measures. He created written law codes, the capitularies, that attempted to govern his vast lands consistently. He established travelling royal inspectors who crossed the empire, checking that his laws were being followed. And he built Aachen Cathedral. Parts of it still stand. You can visit today. You can stand inside the octagonal dome he commissioned in 796 AD and look up at the same ceiling he looked up at 1200 years ago. One more detail about this man who built such a monument to learning. Charlemagne taught himself to read Latin as an adult and could understand Greek, but he could never master the physical act of writing. Einhard describes him keeping writing tablets under his pillow, practicing his letters in the night. The hand that signed documents with a mark could not form words. He began too late, Einhard says, simply and without judgment. He began too late. When Charlemagne died on January 28, 814 AD, his body preserved with aromatic spices in the early medieval tradition, before eventually becoming the skeletonized remains that scientists would study 12 centuries later, he left behind one legitimate heir, Louis, called the Pious. Louis was not his father. He was gentle, where Charlemagne had been forceful, indecisive, where Charlemagne had been relentless. But he held the empire together for 26 years, and he married his children into the royal families of every emerging European kingdom. In 843 AD, Louis's 3 surviving sons signed the Treaty of Verdun. They divided the empire between them. Charles the Bald took the western portion, West Francia, the ancestor of modern France. Louis the German took the eastern portion, East Francia, the ancestor of modern Germany. Look at that map. The border between West Francia and East Francia in 843 AD is essentially the border between France and Germany today. The European Union's headquarters in Brussels sits almost exactly on that old Carolingian boundary. The Charlemagne Prize, awarded since 1950 to those who contribute to European unity, is named for him specifically, because without him, Europe as an idea barely exists. But it is not only through Louis that Charlemagne's DNA spread. The daughters, the ones he refused to let marry, had their unofficial children. His concubines had children. His grandsons married across every royal house in Europe. His descendants entered the population without royal titles, but with royal genes, quietly, across every kingdom that emerged from his broken empire. Each of these pathways was a branch, and each branch branched again, and again, until the network was so dense it saturated a continent. So how does the science actually work? How can anyone claim with mathematical confidence that you carry Charlemagne's DNA? Let us start with the mathematics of genealogy. You have 2 biological parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents. Each generation back, the number doubles. Go back 40 generations, roughly 1200 years, which is exactly how far back Charlemagne is, and the mathematical number of ancestors you should have is over 1 trillion, far larger than the entire human population that has ever existed. This seems impossible, and it is, because genealogical trees collapse. People marry their cousins. Populations are geographically isolated. The same ancestors appear on multiple branches of your family tree simultaneously. This is called pedigree collapse. Pedigree collapse means that a small number of individuals who lived around 1200 years ago are genealogical ancestors of a massive proportion of today's population. A landmark study published in the journal Nature in 2004 by Roeder, Olsen and Chang calculated that the most recent common ancestor of all living Europeans probably lived somewhere between 600 and 1000 AD. That is exactly Charlemagne's era. He had nearly 20 children, many grandchildren who married into every royal house, daughters who had unofficial children who spread without royal record. The model predicts near total genealogical saturation of the European population within a few centuries of his death. The distinction between genealogical descent and genetic descent matters here. You can be genealogically descended from someone without inheriting any of their specific DNA. The segments get shuffled and some disappear over generations. But the probability that you carry at least some genetic material from Charlemagne, given the sheer number of pathways, is extremely high. His Y chromosome, the direct paternal line, is a separate story. It passed from father to son unchanged. Researchers have attempted to identify it by working with European noble families who can document an unbroken male line descent from the Carolingians. His direct male line dynasty, in the traditional sense, ended in 987 AD with the death of Louis V of France, the last Carolingian king. The line died not in battle, it ended with an empty cradle. His bones in Aachen tell us more. They belong to a man approximately 184 centimetres tall, the 99th percentile for his era. Slender, according to bone measurements, dark brown hair shot through with blonde before it went white, according to forensic analysis of hair trapped in a wax seal on a document in the French National Archives. He walked with a limp in his final years. He suffered from osteoarthritis and gout. Einhard, who knew him personally, says he died of pleurisy. Charlemagne died in the winter of 814. He had reigned for over 40 years. He had fought, by some counts, 53 military campaigns. He had built a civilization in the spaces between them. The empire he created did not survive intact. His grandsons divided it within 30 years, and those divisions became the nations that would spend the next millennium fighting each other. And yet, the languages those kingdoms speak descend from the Latin his schools preserved. The church that shaped their culture was the church he empowered. The idea that Western Europe constitutes a civilization, not just a peninsula, owes more to him than to any other single figure. He executed 4,500 people in a single day. He also saved the literature of the ancient world from oblivion. He forced baptism on populations who didn't want it. He also built the institutional framework that allowed medieval Europe to develop into something more than perpetual tribal warfare. He kept his daughters captive at court. He also wept for his wife. He kept writing tablets under his pillow because he wanted to learn and never quite managed it. He was not a symbol, he was a man. And the DNA in the veins of hundreds of millions of people alive today, people who have never heard his name, who couldn't point to Aachen on a map, who are going about their ordinary lives right now, is almost certainly his. He is not in a textbook, he is in you. That is the French DNA mystery, that is Charlemagne.